Welcome in this new episode of the Wilderness series, and we are going to talk today about the impermanence of the self. If you like this theme or if you like these videos, then comment like that below the video. Preferably also push a like on the video, and perhaps you can ring the bell if this is a YouTube video so that you can...
Dear friend, welcome in this new episode from the Wilderness series. We are going to talk about the impermanence of the self. This is a very big theme, also philosophically, and that means that we're going to get some philosophical canons in our story today. When you like this theme, these kind of subjects, then please make sure you put a comment below the video where you tell me like that, and maybe you can help the channel in general by giving it a like. And if you are interested in seeing more of this series or of my channel in general, then make sure you also ring the bell so that you get notified by the Google demon. When you are thinking about the impermanence of the self, there are a lot of elements that play a role. For you, what is your idea about yourself? You have an idea about yourself being permanent or being impermanent. People have changeable ideas about it, and throughout history a lot of people did have thoughts about what would be valid and what would not be valid in this kind of considerations. So let's no longer dally and start thinking and talking about this kind of subjects, and hopefully we can get an interesting discussion also in the Patreon group that is connected with this channel, and we come to bright new ideas. And for this we have to ask ourselves a few questions. Since the 1890s, when William James published his introduction into psychology, he described the self as being different in different circumstances. That means that when you are in situation A or in situation B, you behave different. That means in a way that there seems to be a changeability about the self. There are many more things to say about that, and we're going to discuss this, of course, in this video. When I talk about Daoist thought, I very often talk about the fragmentary nature of our minds. This is not exactly the same, but you can see after this story that we get very close to this subject. When we look at the general idea about the self, we very often describe this, or people very often describe it as a self-reflective consciousness. That means that we see the self as something that is conscious. We separate the self from the acting I in life. We do that as describing basically the self as a sort of a meta I, you can say, so that the I is self-reflecting about the I. You are, of course, the I in that sense. What we can say from this is that the self seems to be like an eye that looks into the mirror and reflects upon itself. When you do like that, you look in the mirror and you look upon yourself, then what you see, of course, is not very objective. That is very subjective, because you are like a judge judging yourself, and it depends on the way how you perceive nature and the world, how you judge yourself. That means there is no objective standard in such, and you see that in the modern science, people try to find an objective standard about the reality of the world through instrumentation, but it is, of course, people who make these instruments, and therefore they make these instruments to prove particular things based on where is their worldview. You see that everything in that is paradoxical. In philosophy, the self is seen as a bunch of qualities that are being tied up in a bundle, you can say, and as such, these unique qualities shape what we call our essential being, and that essential being is reflected through your consciousness. Within the religious view, people very often describe differences between the self and the true self. And as a religious view goes, that makes that the self itself sees some elements of itself as real and some elements of itself as not so real. The experience of the self, of ourselves, seems to be very constant. That means that it seems to be always there. We are always aware, or we are always thinking, or we are always conscious, or something like this. Except, of course, when we sleep. That defies the whole point of being conscious and that permanence of the self. But at the moment when we look at this perception, you can see that in philosophy, somebody like Plato, he talked about the permanence of the self as being timeless and formless. And that means that the true self exists outside of the realm of our daily experience. And therefore, many people have the idea that this reality around us is partly illusionary. That has to do with the asymmetry of life, in the sense that we see things around us. It seems all very organized and systematic, but what I see in my conversations with clients and with students, and what I read in the world and what I see in the news, is that whatever plans you make, they always seem to end up in something else than you originally planned. At the moment when you see that happening, this asymmetry makes that life remains confusing, and as a result of that, we are less successful in being humans than we would like to think. So on the one hand, we feel like we are constant through ourselves is constant. On the other hand, we see that there's all kinds of circumstances that are out of our control, and that self then in that sense is a little bit like a wandering thing, like a hungry ghost. What we can conclude from Plato is therefore that his idea that the true self is basically formless. If you live in a formless existence, yourself, your true self, also has to be formless. If it is timeless, that means your true self also is timeless. So the realm of through forms, whatever kind of things, they are basically formless. When you look at the self as a whole, that means the self that we live in our daily lives, that one is fickle. There is a famous saying by Plato. He said, the greatest victory is to conquer yourself, and the greatest shame is to be conquered by yourself. That means that the self seems to be something that is separate from ourselves. Talking about the self is so complicated. Anyway, it shows that Plato didn't see the self necessarily in a very good light. It depended very much on your own actions as an I to see if the self was good or wasn't good. This is not so very far away from the Confucian view, where Confucians actually talk about whether people are born good or born evil. In that sense that somebody like Sun Tzu, who has a quite negative view on the nature of human beings, says that people are born as demons and we need education to find permanence, you can say, and as a result of that also find permanence in being good. While in Mencius, he suggests that people are born good by nature, but because of the circumstances of life we can turn evil, so we need education to make sure that we stay on the path of goodness. Plato said about the self that there are three different qualities which are relevant for the self. He said that the self is rational, it is appetitive, it has desires, and it is spirited. This is a little bit different from what we see in Daoism, where they say, well, when you talk about human beings and their mind and so on, we are ruled usually by our aversions, and our aversions are made from desire, anger, and fear. That is maybe a little bit more negative view than Plato even. In Platonism itself, we can see that the mind itself has a sense of self, and it has a desire to understand the things around itself and what it is made of. So there we talk about the self as a drive, you can say. Aristotle, on the other hand, he suggested the self as an intellect and that it is separated from our body. We will see more thoughts like these two mainstream of thoughts in other philosophical thought thinkers. When we look at a thinker like Thomas Aquinas, who is an important thinker, no matter what you want to say about his thoughts, he had the idea that the self-awareness of the self is not something self-evident. He had the idea that it had to be triggered by events in life, and as a result of that, you gradually can develop self-awareness about your actions. That means that people by nature are not self-aware. That is a very interesting thought, because also in Taoism they have this idea, this notion, which is different from Aquinas, by the way, where you could have a immortal part, but you have to exercise to get that part. That means that in Daoland they follow a similar path of reasoning, like, okay, you could have that, but you don't have it. There are circumstances that are required to get that. While in, for instance, Christianity, you have a soul which is given by God, and that soul, which is basically the self, can make choices about life, can help to, anyway, inform choices in life. What we can say about Aquinas' thought, he talks about this aspect of what the self does or when it comes about, but he doesn't really explain in that sense what the self is. When we look at the philosopher René Descartes, he talked about the self as being the mind, and he talked about the mind in contact with the body, and the body then in that sense is the not self, which is in itself a very complicated way of thinking about the self, separating the self in on the one hand a Platonic thing of permanence, and on the other hand is actually more like how Aristotle thought. In a way similar like Aquinas, Augustinus, the church father, had the idea about the self as existing in the relationship to the divine or to God. That means in the thoughts of Augustine that the fulfillment of the self is only found when you find the love of God, which is also another way of thinking about the self, of course. It means that the self is like a vessel or a function that has to be completed. When we go to the famous philosopher David Hume, he sees the self more as a bundle of qualities and perceptions. So then we are basically back at what we nowadays call the philosophical self. Buddhism and Taoism, they suggest that we shouldn't hold on to the self, because the self itself is illusionary, and as a result of that, there is no need to hold on to it. Just thinking about the self as being permanent or being constant seems to be a little bit ridiculous. Self-awareness then is illusionary. Yeah, so that means that self-awareness doesn't really exist. Buddhism puts that in a sort of a Platonic reality, and Taoism is, well, it's Taoism, and that means that it follows a path akin to what it sees in nature as a whole. That's the wilderness thought that we are talking about in this series. Buddhism suggests that with the extinguishing of self-awareness, the self dissolves. That means that the self-awareness, the being aware of yourself, actually aggravates the sense of self as being permanent. And at the moment when you stop being self-aware, then at that moment the whole awareness thing disappears. In that sense, the self doesn't really exist, but it's just a tool for your consciousness. Anyway, I think that it implies that, as far as I am concerned. When we look at our wilderness thought, we discussed in the beginning the civility of the interactions between beings and nature. That in itself is not self-aware. It is intelligent, clearly, because it seems to progress in a particular kind of way. I'm not necessarily talking about evolution here, but the beings on the larger scale of the civil society of wilderness seems to progress continuously to a more altruistic and cooperative interaction. While on the individual scale, we seem to be competitive and so on. So Darwinism is about the individual, you can say, while in fact as a species we have to interact with wilderness to make sure that we maintain our existence and get supported by nature. So that means that the I, as an individual, actually is, dependent on the self-awareness to let go of our self-awareness so that we can play our role in nature as it is intended. Buddhism and Taoism, they suggest that we shouldn't hold on to the self, since the self itself is illusionary. Buddhism and Taoism suggest that we shouldn't hold on to the self because it suggests that the self itself is illusionary. That means basically means that awareness itself is an illusion. So if you are self-aware, you are well aware of something that isn't really there, and because it is the self that is self-aware, that awareness also isn't there. It's a little bit complicated, but that's what you get when you go deep into theory. When you are thinking about these kind of things, you can say that Buddhism puts the same thing in the context of sort of a Platonic reality, in the sense that they see sort of a true self, which is part of the incarnation cycle that everybody always talks about, that they officially took from Hinduism and Jainism and other religions maybe also. And the concept of Taoism, the concept of reincarnation is also known in Taoism, but it has never been so prevalent as in Buddhism. But right through the palms. Was good?
Yeah. I don't know if I just hallucinated that it looked like I didn't feel anything, but it looked like my arm just went like open.
Okay, very good.